Welcome to our deep dive into the life and legacy of King Eric XIV, better known by his fearsome moniker, the Mad Butcher of Sweden. In this extended exploration, we will delve far deeper than the surface-level anecdotes and shocking events that defined Eric's tumultuous reign, uncovering the historical context, political pressures, cultural influences, and psychological unraveling that shaped him from a promising young prince into one of history's most infamous rulers. King Eric XIV's life was more than a sensational anecdote in Swedish history. It was a dramatic intersection of political ambition, familial tensions, Europe's broader shift during the Reformation, and personal demons that manifested in acts of brutality. Whether it was his relentless search for a royal bride, his conflicts with powerful Swedish families, or the rumors of witchcraft swirling around his beloved mistress, Eric knew no shortage of intrigue. His story stands as a mesmerizing blend of ambition, betrayal, paranoia, and bloodshed that forever changed the course of Swedish history. We'll revisit the entire saga, from his tragic childhood and scandal-ridden private life to the brutal decisions that left Sweden's nobility trembling, and finally, to his downfall and notorious death. In doing so, we'll also highlight details often overlooked or omitted from shorter tellings of his story, painting as complete a picture as we can of this complex and troubled monarch. Childhood. If the gruesome tale of Eric XIV of Sweden is anything to go by, it was hard to be a 16th-century king. Then again, Eric was unhinged, immoral, and the perpetrator of one of the most infamous acts ever committed in royal history. In fact, his incredibly bloody reign was almost enough to justify his infamous end. Eric XIV's brutal rule ended in a coup, and the Mad King walked happily into a cell, unaware of the chilling fate ahead of him. Though Eric XIV would soon earn a reputation as one of the maddest men in Sweden, his beginnings were tragic in another way entirely. Born on December 13, 1533, as the heir of King Gustav I and Queen Catherine of Sweden, the boy got precious little time with his mother. She passed away before he was even 2 years old. Maybe this explains his horrific rage later on in life. The environment into which Eric was born was one of considerable flux. His father, King Gustav I, often referred to historically as Gustav Vasa, was himself a revolutionary figure. Gustav's uprising against the Danish-dominated Kalmar Union effectively secured Sweden's independence, but it also introduced new tensions. Eric's earliest years were thus marked by a father who was both consolidating power at home, breaking the centuries-long grip of certain aristocratic families, and keeping a watchful eye on external threats, especially from Denmark. Growing up in the Vasa court meant that Eric likely absorbed an education that was both scholarly and practical, reflecting his father's push toward modernization. Surviving documents and anecdotal records describe his unusual aptitude for mathematics and languages, a skill set that would have been invaluable for international diplomacy, trade negotiations, and reading the shifting winds of European power. Sweden was gradually aligning itself with Lutheran forms of Protestantism under Gustav's rule, meaning the young Eric might have also been exposed to intense religious debates, a backdrop that could help explain his sometimes erratic interest in spiritual matters and the occult later in life. Eric's tutor, Dionysius Burus, represented a more radical strand of humanist thinking for the time. The fact that Eric gravitated toward such a figure indicates a vibrant intellectual curiosity. Dionysius reportedly taught Eric not just the basics of scholarship, Latin grammar, rhetorical exercises, arithmetic, but also more progressive or unorthodox ways of interpreting the world. These might have included a deeper inquiry into astrological and hermetic traditions, which were not unusual for Renaissance princes but definitely set Eric on a path of intense personal exploration. The tragedy, of course, is that Eric would later reward Dionysius's devotion with an act of lethal betrayal, underlining just how far Eric's paranoia and instability would spiral. No account of Eric's childhood can overlook the death of his mother, Queen Catherine, before he was even 2 years old. In an age where paternal kings ruled with formidable distance, mothers were often crucial nurturers. The absence of Catherine likely compounded Eric's sense of detachment, fueling a longing for stability or affection that he rarely seemed to find. While it's speculative to attribute all of his adult behavior to this early trauma, the lack of maternal grounding certainly forms a piece of the puzzle, especially when combined with an ambitious, stern father who had little patience for perceived weakness. Even as a child, accounts suggest that Eric showed signs of a tempestuous spirit. Though highly gifted, he was prone to dramatic mood swings and outbursts. Courtiers who served the Vasa family during this era wrote about a boy who could be charming and engaging one moment, then unexpectedly sullen or abrasive the next. In the insular world of the Renaissance Swedish court, such behavioral shifts were noted, albeit with caution. After all, no one wanted to risk the wrath of the future king. All of these early details point to a youth shaped by intelligence, personal loss, and the possibility of an unstable temperament. These traits would only become more pronounced and Eric inherited the throne. Family. The lineage of Gustav Vasa was already complex. Multiple marriages produced several half-siblings, which inevitably led to courtly factions. Eric's half-brother John, later John III, would become his major rival. Charles, another half-brother who eventually ruled as Charles IX, also had ambitions. Cecilia, mentioned here, was embroiled in numerous smaller scandals and intrigues. The infamous moment when Eric outed her for being caught in bed with a man might have been motivated as much by Eric's paranoia or show of power as by moral outrage. The event involving Cecilia was more than just an embarrassing moment of sibling betrayal, it highlighted the precarious balance of family politics. At the time, being found in a compromising position could utterly destroy a noblewoman's prospects. By publicly shaming Cecilia, Eric cemented his dominance. Some historians argue that he might have also been lashing out at any vulnerability in the broader family structure, ensuring that all his siblings understood his power. Whatever the truth, this scandal exemplifies Eric's self-serving tendencies, a trait repeatedly observed in his later reign. Eric's appearance and healthy physique were significant assets for a royal in the mid-16th century. Royal portraits from this period were carefully curated to project both authority and attractiveness. Eric, with his reddish blonde hair and well-groomed beard, fit the Renaissance ideal of a virile, commanding ruler. Historians suggest that his commanding stature and confident bearing initially made him popular among certain court factions. While his paranoid nature would eventually overshadow any initial goodwill, it's evident that his early presence could be quite magnetic. Beneath these family dynamics, the shadow of inheritance loomed large. Eric was the eldest surviving son of Gustav I, making him the primary heir. John and Charles might have respected him publicly, but as we'll see, they kept a close eye on his mental decline and seized the first opportunity to challenge his authority. Some historians argue that Gustav Vasa's own approach to power, centralizing authority and curtailing the influence of the aristocracy, set the stage for a fractious environment among his children. Eric inherited not just the crown but also a court steeped in suspicion and a family dynamic rife with potential betrayals. Career. When Eric ascended the throne in 1560, Sweden was on the cusp of transitioning from a relatively modest kingdom in northern Europe to a rising power. Gustav Vasa had already laid the groundwork by reforming the army, church, and administration, but many aristocratic families still held considerable sway. Eric's immediate move to demote nobility, including his own half-brothers, was a telling sign. He was determined to be the single most powerful man in Sweden, unwilling to share the limelight. This period of Eric's reign cannot be understood without referencing the Nordic 7 Years' War. Initiated in part by disputes over titles and claims to territories in the Baltic region, the war pitted Sweden against Denmark, Lubeck, and eventually Poland. It was a brutal conflict characterized by shifting alliances, intense rivalries, and devastating raids. Eric's paranoia about nobles possibly conspiring with foreign enemies wasn't entirely baseless. In a time of war, internal factions often used external powers to further their own ambitions. However, his approach, filled with erratic punishments and a disregard for due process, only heightened internal tensions. Eric's repeated marriage proposals to major European figures reveal a strategic approach to securing alliances as well as a personal longing for recognition. Marrying into a prominent royal family could bring diplomatic advantages, but each rejection, whether from Mary Queen of Scots or Renata of Lorraine, chipped away at Eric's international prestige. The most dramatic near-miss was with Elizabeth I of England. Though Elizabeth often entertained multiple foreign suitors to keep them politically invested, it's significant that Eric was so convinced he could win her hand that he abandoned his longtime mistress, Agdaper's daughter, who Eric nicknamed Caritas, and he made serious plans to travel to England. In part, Elizabeth's stalling tactics were typical of her diplomatic style. She rarely outright refused proposals, preferring to keep negotiations alive to extract favorable terms. Eric, perhaps misreading this as genuine interest, became ever more eager, culminating in the fiasco where he prepared to sail to England, only to be halted by Gustav I's death. Upon becoming king, Eric's drastic actions toward the nobility arose from more than just suspicion. He genuinely feared internal conspiracies that might unseat him, especially given the complex web of alliances among Swedish aristocrats. It didn't help that John, his half-brother, was forging external ties through marriage. Eric's solution was a heavy-handed campaign of demotions, fines, and occasionally arrests. If his father had attempted to centralize power through legislation and reformation, Eric did so through brute force and intimidation. By 1563, the royal court noted shifts in Eric's demeanor. Records describe him as increasingly mercurial, prone to lashing out. He might order an arrest one day and rescind it the next, or he might publicly humiliate a noble over a minor slight. This climate of fear eroded any loyalty the nobility might have held, pushing many to conspire with each other, or eventually, with John or Charles, to remove the king. Nils Stur's plight exemplified this. His family was one of the most illustrious in Sweden, yet Eric singled him out repeatedly, culminating in the events that would become known as the Stur murders. Scandal in May 1567, Eric's obsession with the Stur family tragically coincided with a total mental breakdown. The gruesome and bizarre spree known as the Stur murders stands out as one of the darkest episodes in Swedish royal history. He detained Nils Stur at Uppsala Castle, along with Nils's father, Svante, and a handful of other nobles, and then proclaimed that he could marry whomever he wanted, a reference to his plan to wed his mistress rather than any royal match. What followed has lived in infamy. The king's behavior in the coming days was more than just erratic, he had lost touch with reality. He wandered around the castle dungeons, at points even begging the Stures for forgiveness, yet never releasing them. Then, without warning, he unsheathed his dagger and stabbed Nils Stur in the chest or arm, according to some accounts. While one of Eric's lackeys finished the job, Eric entered Svante Stur's cell and delivered a chilling speech. He rambled an illogical apology about how he had to kill Svante too, since the noble would never forgive him for Nils's death and would seek revenge. Before leaving the castle, Eric ordered his men to massacre most of the remaining prisoners for the same reason: they would never forgive him, resulting in a tragic domino effect. Swedish historians often view this as the culmination of Eric's festering paranoia and possible mental illness. Some have speculated that he suffered from what might be understood today as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, given his cyclical episodes of mania and depression. The Stur family, historically, was emblematic of old Swedish aristocracy. Leaders like Svante Stur and Sten Stur, in earlier generations, were famed for challenging or guiding monarchs. By the time of Eric's reign, the Stures were deeply entwined in the politics of the realm. For Eric, they became both scapegoats for his paranoia and symbolic threats to the absolute authority he desperately wanted to maintain. Contemporaries describe Eric's eyes as wild and vacant during this period, his speech slurring from weeping remorse to furious threats. The macabre detail of him begging forgiveness from the very prisoners he refused to release exemplifies his inner turmoil. Some in the royal court believed Eric was truly possessed by evil spirits, a reflection of the era's superstition. Others suspected witchcraft or demonic influences around him, especially once rumors about his mistress Karin Mansdotter emerged. Modern scholars, however, tend to see these events as evidence of a serious mental breakdown. Eric's horrific acts didn't end there. After leaving the castle, he happened upon his old beloved tutor, Dionysius Bourus, who tried to calm him down. In a final act of madness, Eric ordered men to slay his tutor as well. For a brief time, these murders were Sweden's best-kept secret. Guards pretended the prisoners were still alive and even accepted food from their families. In the delirium of these acts, Eric wandered into the forest and disappeared for 2 days. Eventually, courtiers found him dressed as a peasant in a tiny village called Udala. Still out of his senses, Eric returned to Stockholm, but his court was empty. No one with half a brain wanted to risk his temper. Desperate, they called in his stepmother, Catherine Stenbock, who listened to Eric's pleas for forgiveness and forced him to pay reparations to the slain nobles' families, along with a promise never to go near them again. After the murders, the attempt by guards to pretend that the prisoners were still alive suggests the depth of fear that Eric's associates had. They presumably hoped that if Eric recovered from his frenzy, he might show mercy, or at least not punish them for failing to protect or rescue the Stures. This also indicates the labyrinthine politics of the time. Admitting that the king had slaughtered high-ranking nobles could open the door for rebellion, so secrecy was the only way to preserve some semblance of order until the crisis passed. Eric's 2-day sojourn in the forest, disguised as a peasant, speaks volumes about his disordered mind. Not only had the king fled the scene of his crimes, but he seemingly had no plan, wandering aimlessly until found. When he was eventually brought back to Stockholm, many of his courtiers fled the capital, fearful that another outbreak of violence was imminent. The arrival of his stepmother Catherine Stenbock and her subsequent arrangement to pay off the victims' families was a desperate measure to placate a furious nobility on the brink of taking action. The Sture murders effectively destroyed Eric's credibility as a just ruler. Even those who had thus far tried to overlook his eccentricities now recognized that this king was dangerously unpredictable. The Swedish nobility, whose support was critical in any monarchy of the era, began plotting ways to curtail or end Eric's reign. Marriage. Despite his breakdown, Eric hadn't forgotten his new love. Since 1565, he'd been obsessed with a serving girl, the comely Karin Mansdotter. Karin Mansdotter's rise from a serving girl to the Queen of Sweden is a remarkable tale on its own. In an era when royal marriages were almost exclusively used for political alliances, Karin stood out as a figure of scandal and fascination. She was from a humble background, her father was a prison guard or possibly a peasant farmer, and her beauty and gentle demeanor reportedly captivated Eric beyond reason. Yes, accusations of witchcraft were rife in 16th-century Europe, especially when powerful men made surprising decisions seemingly against their own best interests. The rumor that Karin used a spell or potion to ensnare Eric is more reflective of the era's beliefs than of Karin herself. It was an easy way for courtiers and commoners to rationalize how a low-born woman could so thoroughly charm a king known for his vicious paranoia. Eric lavished gifts on Karin, clothes, jewels, and personal attendants, essentially staging a royal makeover for his beloved. He even taught her to read and write, an unusual step considering many women at the time, especially from humble backgrounds, did not receive formal education. Yet this was also a practical move if Eric intended her to serve as queen by his side. He wanted her to command respect, or at least to conduct herself suitably at court. Some accounts suggest that Karin's relative innocence and genuine affection for Eric provided him with a sense of emotional security he lacked elsewhere. In a secret ceremony on December 29, 1567, Eric married Karin. Then, in 1568, they had an official wedding. But, Eric's paranoia nearly turned his wedding into a bloodbath. He suspected his half-brothers would stage a coup or interrupt the ceremony. Only Karin's intervention, warning his stepmother of Eric's designs, saved their lives. This scenario illustrates how unstable Eric was, on one hand, capable of love and tenderness toward Karin, and on the other, prepared to kill his siblings to ensure no threat to his marriage. Karin's elevation to queen did not ingratiate Eric to the Swedish nobility; if anything, it magnified their contempt. By ignoring noble brides and choosing Karin, Eric signaled that he neither needed nor wanted the support of highborn families. This added to the sense among the aristocracy that Eric was out of control, disregarding the political traditions that had stabilized the kingdom in the past. Indeed, some historians argue that Karin's coronation was the final nail in Eric's coffin, convincing the aristocracy they had to act to protect their interests and possibly the kingdom itself. In 1568, Eric briefly rallied and attempted to govern more rationally, likely buoyed by Karin's calming presence. However, this period of stability was short-lived. The murder of his personal secretary over a trivial slight was a sign that any veneer of normalcy was tenuous at best. The incident only reaffirmed the courtiers' worst fears: the king was dangerously unpredictable and would kill on a whim. Other relationships. Eric's shifting romantic liaisons were symptomatic of both a roving eye and a deeper need for validation. Agdaper's daughter, for instance, bore him children, yet he abandoned her in favor of his grandiose attempt to marry Queen Elizabeth I. Later, after failing to secure Elizabeth's hand, he still did not fully return to Agda in any meaningful, stable sense. Instead, he cycled through multiple mistresses, earning the court's derisive nickname for his ever-growing retinue. This pattern shows Eric's inconsistency and underscores how he treated relationships as another avenue to demonstrate his royal prerogative. Eric's interest in astrology and other esoteric pursuits was not entirely unusual for a Renaissance monarch. Many rulers consulted astrologers for everything from personal health to military campaigns. Yet in Eric's case, it fed into his paranoia, as exemplified by his suspicions of Niels Stuer, based on a horoscope. His belief that a blonde man would succeed him created a self-fulfilling paranoia. The more he tried to thwart that prophecy, the more enemies he created, which only brought him closer to that dreaded fate. In 1568, John and Charles made their move. They leveraged the widespread dissatisfaction among nobles and their fear of Eric's unpredictability. They led a rebellion, quickly gaining enough support to overthrow Eric. The ousted king was imprisoned, along with his wife Karin. This shift in power was swift because Eric had so thoroughly alienated the aristocracy that few were willing to defend him. The captivity Eric and Karin endured was harsh. They were shifted between various castles to prevent their supporters from orchestrating successful rescue attempts. During this imprisonment, Karin bore 2 children, both of whom died young in the dismal conditions. Historical records paint a bleak picture: minimal comfort, strict guards, and an ever-present sense of despair. Despite the personal tragedies that befell Eric in captivity, his earlier deeds had hardened the hearts of those in power. They believed that returning him to the throne would be catastrophic. The final indignity occurred on June 14, 1573, when Eric's captors forcibly separated him from Karin. This act was meant to prevent further children who might claim the throne or rally supporters. Eric's note, "My wife has been taken from me," speaks to his utter helplessness. Once a man who wielded near absolute power, Eric was reduced to lamenting the removal of his sole emotional anchor. Eric's final years were spent in grim isolation. The pleas, the attempts to escape, and the negotiations for his release came to nothing. His brother John, now King John III, determined that Eric was too dangerous to be left alive. Rebellions in Eric's name continued to spring up, proving that some segments of Swedish society still viewed him as the legitimate monarch or at least as a figurehead for their discontent. On February 26, 1577, attendants found the once and former King Eric XIV of Sweden cold and unresponsive in the cell where he had spent 7 years. The regime had faced one too many attempts to reinstate him, and he had become too big a threat to live. Scientists later discovered the grim truth, as subsequent investigations revealed, was that Eric's demise had been orchestrated through poison, an all-too-common method for dealing with inconvenient royals in the turbulent world of 16th-century politics. Poison was a convenient method of disposal for troublesome royals. Arsenic, known colloquially in that era as inheritance powder, was colorless, tasteless in certain forms, and could be administered surreptitiously. The finality of Eric's death, pinned to a meal of pea soup, underscores the cold calculation of the conspirators. They waited until the political climate demanded a final solution, ensuring that Eric would never again threaten John III's reign. The 1958 exhumation provided scientific backing for centuries-old rumors. Traces of arsenic in Eric's remains were strong enough to confirm poisoning. This discovery ended any speculation that Eric might have died naturally or from the deteriorating conditions of his imprisonment. It also offered a stark example of how royal intrigue could transcend generations, with modern technology revealing the hidden truths of a centuries-old crime. Eric's life serves as a case study in the perils of unchecked authority and the destructive power of unbridled paranoia. Though he might have started as a talented, well-intentioned heir, the pressures of kingship, and possibly underlying mental illness, led him down a path of brutality and isolation. In the decades and centuries following his death, Swedish historians and the public grappled with how to remember him. Was he a monstrous tyrant wholly responsible for his actions, or a tragically ill man placed in a role he could not manage? The answer lies somewhere in between. Eric was undeniably a product of his time, an era of shifting alliances, brutal warfare, and limited medical understanding of psychological disorders. Eric XIV's life has long captivated playwrights, novelists, and filmmakers. In 1899, the celebrated Swedish dramatist August Strindberg brought The King's Story to the stage, an adaptation of which later became the film Karin Mansdotter. Adding to the legend, Finnish author Mika Waltari showcased the royal romance in his 1942 historical novel Karin Mansdotter, further immortalizing the passionate and tumultuous bond between Eric XIV and his beloved queen. This timeless tale of intrigue and devotion continues to enchant audiences, standing as a testament to the enduring allure of their unlikely love story. And that's what today's video is about. Thank you for joining us on this riveting exploration of King Eric XIV's turbulent reign. His life, marked by brutal power plays, controversial romances, and a harrowing final act, remains a cautionary tale of what can happen when paranoia and unchecked authority collide. We hope this journey has shed new light on one of the most notorious chapters in Sweden's royal past. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating deep dives into the darker corners of history.